So, Carrie, what do you think about, you have chosen 20, 30 images of great uh, women in early American cinema. What are your thoughts about talking about them and looking through their lives?
Well, it always has been, or for the last couple of decades, uh, a source of real joy for me. But now it provides also a whole nother world to go to, which is just fabulous. Um, let's hope it doesn't sound too strange, but I've come to think of them as my dead girlfriends. And I know them so well. I know what they care about and how hard they work, and so they both, they inspire me and they energize me in a way and kind of keep me on a path
How
because
do
I
you know
see what they did right and I see what where the mistakes were made.
how do you know them so well? Are you talking about researching in archives, etc., to read? I one of the first books of yours I read was this one, which is you edited the writings of Anita Luce, who we'll get onto. But how do you actually know them so well?
Well, when I say no, I mean I've spent a lot of time with them. I've spent as much time with them as I've spent with a lot of live people I know, right? And I would consider close friends. So, I've read their writings because most of them are writers. And I've read their diaries and I've read their letters. And I've read things they probably would prefer me not to have read. But their appointment books sometimes can be remarkably revelatory. Uh, it's and then all those things weave together over the years, right? So that's what I mean. I don't mean to be, impose anything on them by saying I feel like I know them well, but I have spent an incredible amount of time with them.
And just a moment on you, Carrie. Before you got into film history and before you wrote your great books, and your books have inspired many of us so much. You were what were you? You were an activist, and were you a detective as well?
I was a private investigator. Uh, right out of college, I was going to go to law school, but I got a great job as a private investigator for a group of lawyers, and then went to work for legal aid, which was I spent like 2 years suing the sheriff for conditions in the county jail, for instance, and that's what I was investigating. And then investigating individual cases and defense cases for Iranian students for protesting the Shah when he came. I mean, crazy things. But I had a great time. And I learned a lot. And it turns out that private investigating is a wonderful school to go to for being a biographer. Because you just convince yourself you're going to find the information. You just keep digging. Or as Kevin Brownlow says, you take every no as a maybe. Mm-hmm. It's just you keep looking. And being a PI taught me that. And before I did that, really, starting in high school, I had been an anti-war activist and very quickly became involved in different feminist organizations and pro-choice organizations. I was president of the California Abortion Rights Action League and the National Women's Political Caucus, and ran political campaigns for women candidates. So that's what I was immersed in. And of course, film was always a source of nurturing to me. So when I eventually came to women and film and the history of women in film, it just was a very natural evolution, even if it took me a while to get there.
Yeah. We're about to sort of dive in. We're going to plunge into all these things. And just as I say that plunge in, I know that because I've spent time with you, you're a big swimmer, aren't you? And you said to me the other day that on my fourth length, I have my ideas. What does that mean?
Well, I do my laps. I do backstroke and have for years. And it takes 4 or 5 decent sized laps to clear the head. And on lap 5 and 6 and 7, connections start to be made in the newly cleared out brain, right? I say the only downside of swimming is I haven't figured out yet how to make notes while I'm doing it, because then that would be heaven. Anyway, yes, I do love my swimming. And I'm swimming in a pool right now because, of course, it's all closed. You know, everything's closed. The gyms are closed. Da, 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 da. But a dear friend of mine who happened to be in the cast of Sunset Boulevard allows me to use her pool several mornings a week. And so, of course, not a lot of people know that, but the ones who do joke that, you know, you have to be very careful about swimming in the pool of anyone who had anything to do with Sunset Boulevard.
And we know, for the cinephiles amongst us, we know that. What's that a reference to? The opening shot, William Holden lying
Our
down.
first little bit of trivia today, and I'm sure we'll have many more. All right, so onward.
Trivia. I've never heard you say a trivia thing in your life. Okay, so, you know, we're going to go to somebody. Our first picture is from somebody who, she said, cinema filled her life entirely. I mean, isn't that remarkable? This wasn't somebody who dabbled in cinema. You know, she made 1,000 films and it filled her life entirely. So, Cari, why did you choose this picture, and who is she?
And she spent half her life not making films, and even though they were her life. You know, this, of course, is Alice Guy, who, as I always like to introduce her to people and say, she was not only one of the first the first woman director, she was one of the first directors, period. I mean, she had a job with Gaumont, and she said to him, I'd like to start playing with these cameras, because Gaumont just made the cameras and sold them, didn't do anything with them. And of course, Alice said, well, I'd like to start using them. And he said, well, as long as your secretarial duties don't suffer. And from that, I think you can argue, I resist using the word first on any of these things, the first this, the first that. No. First of all, I hate the competition. Second of all, who the hell knows? All right. But I really do think you can make an argument that Alice was the first director to put the arc together of a film that told a story with different characters that developed. And her initial films were a couple of minutes long. And then, of course, many of them were 10, 15-minute one-reelers. But she was amazing.
And we've got another picture of her in front of her studio. There she is,
studio. Yeah, this is Solax in Fort Lee, New Jersey, which while it was being built. But I love it because, one, she's so little and the studio is so big. Two, it also shows you how, in order to make those silent films, you needed the light. And so it was wide open, half of it. That's what would become one of the ironies of sound, is they needed, silence to make sound pictures. But with silent pictures, it was wide open. They could handle all the noises of nature. And often some of the films were just taken outside. I mean, some of my favorite stills are of, dining room tables with the cloth going in the breeze, or beds with the sheets sort of blowing around because it was being shot outside, because they could shoot anywhere. I mean, the whole idea of calling it, the lot, is that's where they were filming. They were filming on empty lots. That's where we got that term.
And you said earlier that she spent half her time not making pictures, and it was decades in which she was not making pictures. So why did she stop, you think?
Oh, gosh. Well, we're gonna, several of these women run into not very nice husbands, and Alice certainly ran into a not very nice husband, Herbert Blanchet, who started as a cinematographer, but soon took over her entire studio at Solax. And she had 2 children to take care of, one of whom got quite sick, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. She did that. She went off to make another film. By the time she came back, Herbert had taken over everything. She ended up back in France. Her daughter supported her for half the time. I'm sure many of your people know about the documentary called Be Natural, which is the story of Alice's life. And it finally was revealed. I mean, this story of Alice. I don't remember not knowing about Alice because my beloved Mary Lee Bandy, who used to run the film department at MoMA, had Alice's papers. And so right when I started doing even the Francis book, Mary Lee said, well, you can't do anything till you've read Alice's work. And I go, oh, okay. And fortunately it was easy then to go into MoMA, which I did, for about a week, and day in, day out, and read Alice's work. So it always sort of comes as a surprise when 25 years after that, people say to me, oh, nobody knows about Alice Key. Well, I don't remember not knowing about her, but I know I'm one of the lucky ones.
That's frustrating. And does the same apply to Lois Weber? We've got this picture of her, this beautiful picture of her behind 2 cameras. Does the same apply to her? Do people think she's been forgotten?
I love the Lois, especially with the little megaphone there with her name on it. It just it's a delightful picture. Yeah, Lois, if you went to the trades in 1915, her name would be alongside Cecil B. DeMille and Griffith. It was the 3 of them were the 3 great directors of the era. And she directed a film called Hypocrites that when Variety reviewed it, in like a whole half-page spread, they said, after you see Hypocrites, you will never forget the name of Lois Weber. And then she died in 1939, and they ran a 2-line obit. So Variety and everybody else had more or less forgotten about Lois Weber. But she did some huge films, big box office films, in the teens and early 20s. The early 20s, we shift when Harding won, and we got, that Wilson was over, World War I was over. Harding is elected with the tagline, back to normalcy. Well, Lois is still doing films about poverty, about paying teachers very poorly, things that people don't want to see anymore, right?
Are you thinking of a film like The Blot?
Well, The Blot, sure, and Shoes. I mean, can you imagine going to a movie
about a woman sitting on a bench and she's eating her tiny sandwich, and there are rich people on the benches beside her? Isn't that right? Yes.
Yeah, and then deciding whether or not to steal the neighbor's chicken. Sitting out there. I mean, there are some beautiful shots. I mean, you look at a film like Suspense. I mean, again, I don't want to use the first, but you've got those, 3 shots in one. Yeah. And the thief is getting in closer and closer and closer. You have the shots through the rear view mirror of the car.
Yeah.
And Lois would go around and knock on people's doors and say, I really love your house. Can I shoot in it today? Or I'm going to set up outside and use your garden. She went around looking, this is, 1913, 1914, Los Angeles, which is very already spread out, looking for locations. And people didn't do that then, Now, I have to say, with my sense of, feminism and solidarity, I kind of failed to mention that Lois also is assumed had an affair with Alice Guy's husband in the process. Because remember, this is a small group of people, and Lois had started back in Solax, back in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and then come out to Hollywood before Herbert did. Anyway, but God love her.
It's interesting that, because she was paid $50,000 per picture, and then, as you say, she ended up, penniless. And I think, did she have a breakdown, do you think?
I don't think so. I think, in fact, during all that time too, she would still be out. She'd be out lecturing to women's clubs and saying why they should be a director. She made some. She was another one with a husband who, you know, took more than he gave. Let's put it that way. But Lois also, she bought a studio. She was, again, excuse me, the first woman to have her name on her own studio. I always say that because God love Mary Pickford. She was amazing in 100 ways, but being the first one with her name on a studio was not one of them. That came like 4 years after Lois. So Lois spent all her money on the Lois Weber Studios at a time that wasn't smart to do. You certainly couldn't do one movie and then do another movie. You had to be doing several at once. And she then loaned it out. She rented it to Mickey Nealon, who didn't pay the rent, things like that. So it was a variety of things for poor Lois. That was in the mid.
We've already talked about two women who owned or ran studios. So dare I ask what you thought? I think I know the answer. What you thought when you saw the recent Netflix series called Hollywood, which was about, which was set in the 1950s. And here we saw the first woman to run a studio. What was your thought, Cari Beauchamp?
Well, what did she inherited it from a dead husband? I got to be honest. I watched 2 episodes. And I said, that's it. And I fast forwarded through some of the other stuff and I read the writing about it. But to me, and God, I hate to be such a bitch about this, but historical fiction to me is an oxymoron. No, it's either history or it's fiction. It's not both. Mm-hmm. And this reinventing and this, you can be so sloppy. And after, frankly, what Ryan Murphy did to Olivia de Havilland in the last few years of her life, and
you're referring to the
lawsuit over the movie Feud, where she said he put words into her mouth, and his excuse was, "Oh, I didn't want to bother her." No, he didn't want to be bothered with reality, with the real history. That would have messed up his invented stories. And, he's laughing all the way to the bank. So, whatever. But I'd rather watch other things. Let me just put it that way.
Is your objection to historical fiction related to that thing we talked about earlier, which is your detective work almost?
Probably. I have a real passion for facts. I just have a passion for facts, and then putting it together. All my work is always like a great big jigsaw puzzle, and it's the 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. And maybe I don't do the edges first, I do the flowers, I do the sky. Oops, here's a cloud. Let's see what we can put around here. Then when I start to write, I will do that in different sections. Same thing. I'll write about the sections I'm really sure of, right? Anyway, yeah. So,
and talking about
I do have a passion for putting it together.
And that leads us to our next picture, Adela Rogers St. John's. I remember first seeing her in that brilliant TV History of Hollywood.
Kevin Brownlow's and David Kevin Gill's.
Brownlow. I know you're a great friend of Kevin Brownlow. So tell us, for people who don't know who Adela is she?
12-part, 13-part series Hollywood.
Yes.
Which they did just in time to be able to interview the Anita Luces and the Adela Rogers St. John's, who were still with us then, And I love this picture of Adela because her daughter gave it to me. And it's not easy to find pretty pictures of Adela. I mean, if you remember her from Hollywood, she's just, very aggressive and very, like a lioness almost. But this is just a pretty thoughtful picture, and I like that. She's an amazing person. Another friend of mine, Tom Doherty, just did a book on the Lindbergh kidnapping, the baby kidnapping. And he came away, he said one of the most impressive things of all his research was Adela's covering of, she covered it as a journalist for Hearst newspapers and wrote every single day on the trial. And he said the most impressive thing was her her coverage of it and the way she wrote. She was also a screenwriter. She also was the woman who introduced Frances Marion to Lois Weber. Adela knew everybody, and she would pretend, I know this is an example of the frustration, she would pretend she was, tell everybody she was born in San Francisco, because she thought that was a lot classier than Los Angeles. And her father was a very prominent attorney who was also an alcoholic. And the movie A Free Soul that she wrote is supposedly based in part on Lionel Barrymore playing her father, Earl Rogers. But she knew everybody, but she wanted to reinvent herself later on. And when I went into the San Francisco library and was, do film history, see the world, but the San Francisco had a historical collection, and they said they had a manila envelope of material on Adela Rogers. So I said, oh, great, can I see it? And I'm in heaven when I'm doing this kind of thing. And I'm finding, Blue Book with Frances's parents, all kinds of stuff. This is just great. So they come out with this great big manila envelope, and it's empty. And there's a note on it that says, Miss Rogers was in yesterday. This is dated 1970. She was in yesterday and took all the clips to be copied and promises she'll bring them back within a week. Well, of course, I'm reading this 20 some odd years later.
Why? Cari, why does she matter? Why should we know about this woman?
Well, she wrote a lot of movies. She also wrote, she wrote what became The Star is Born. She wrote, the Hollywood movie before that. She knew Los Angeles like nobody's business. And she was a matchmaker for everybody. She put all these people together. She, as I say, introduced Frances to Lois Weber. She took actors and actresses out to the Ince Ranch and said, come on, Tom, give him a chance, right? And they listened to her. She was just feisty as holy hell and a good friend of everybody's. She went back and forth between being a reporter and a screenwriter. She had dozens of lovers, 2 or 3 children, her daughter Elaine, a son who was killed in the war, and then another son, I think, but I have to keep the husband straight. And she's the one, I fell in love with her when she said, a woman can't drive 3 mules. And the 3 mules, were the husband, the work, and the kids. You just can't do it all. You got to pick them.
I think you're quite like her in some way.
Well, but see, there's another thing that you learn from these people, and you learn she had a roughness that I hope I don't need. You know what I mean? She used a brusqueness that as a protection that I hope I don't need. But then I also, she lived to be in her 90s, and her daughter Elaine, God love her, because to be that woman's daughter would have been amazingly horrible to deal with, or just very challenging, let's say. Anyway, so I said, and she loved baseball. She and Tallulah Bankhead were 2 of the biggest baseball fans around, Adela. But Elaine said would take her, with her on errands. And I said, well, what'd she do? And she said, well, I asked her. I was in the store for like an hour, and I came back out, and there was Mom just looking around. And I said, Mom, what do you do all this time? And she said, I look for smiles. And the idea of just her sitting there looking for people who are smiling, for smiles on people's face. So when you have not a lot of other stuff, and you're 95 and you're sitting there in the car waiting because you can't go anyplace else, What do? You look for people with smiling faces, and then you smile back. And I don't know, that really touched me.
Our next picture is somebody you've already mentioned, Frances Marion. You know, we're going to talk about her. You know, is she one of the central figures in your creative life?
Oh, absolutely. When I started to, my first book was on the history of Cannes Film Festival.
Yeah.
And then my agent, who I picked up during the course of that, said, why don't you do a biography of Barbara Streisand or something? And I no, God, no, thank you. And I said, you know what I'd like to do? I looked at my bookcase, and I had a book. I had Mary Pickford's autobiography. I had Lillian Gish's, I had Anita Luce's autobiographies, quote unquote, and I had Adela's autobiography. It's a stretch to call them autobiographies, but anyway, they were all on my shelf. And the other thing that amazed me was they'd been given to me over the years by friends. I hadn't actually bought them. People had said, I saw this and thought of you, which was interesting because I wouldn't have thought of me, but they did. So I took their word for it. So I told my agent what I'd like to do is a cultural history, sort of the women of early Hollywood. Nothing like this had been done then. Professional, but also what brought these women together. And I thought, now there's half a dozen women. Now, I only knew Frances. I had these other people's books, right? But I knew Frances from seeing the name on the credit of films that I loved. I'd seen a lot of silent films, so I'd seen her name on Mary Pickford films. I'd seen it on The Big House, The Champ. This was the name, and I looked her up, and she'd written over 100, 200 films. So, and glorious, just movies for everybody. And so I knew the name, and I got pissed. So, as usual, my two motivating forces tend to be curiosity and getting pissed off. And I was pissed off that I couldn't find information on Frances. And then I finally found a book she wrote, which I realized when I got the original, years later, when I got her original manuscript, she had cut out everything about herself. She just wrote about other people. And she said, oh, I guess other people would, people want to read about these people. They don't care about me, which again pissed me off, but, on and on. But Frances started, and the picture here is she came to Hollywood in 1912 with the man who was then her second husband, and she was a painter of posters for theater. She got a job doing that, but she really wanted to be in the movies. So Adela introduced her to Lois Weber, Adela, who she had known from in San Francisco, and but Lois insisted that she become an extra or an actress because she was so pretty. And Frances says, no, I want to write. And Lois says, no, you're going to act. But soon was having her write lines for the extras, because one of the things from silent films we don't think of very often is that, people could read lips, and they realized that they were watching some period drama. And one woman was talking to another woman about the lousy date she'd had the night before. So Lois Weber was such a stickler for keeping things as clear as possible. She had Frances write dialogue for these people to say to each other, even though it wasn't going to be caught on my microphone. Anyway, that's how I met Frances, and that's how I started, was with this group of half a dozen women writers that I wanted to focus on. But the more I got into it, Frances just kind of skyrocketed to the top. I mean, as Adela said, Frances was the senior all of us sophomores wanted to be.
And you say I've been to your house, and you've got this, it's a self-portrait of Frances on the wall, isn't it? Is it? She painted herself?
Well, downstairs, down here, that's a painting that was done of her.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't mean to get too weird, but people give me this stuff. The picture of Frances, which if I move this just a little, you can see, I think. Hold
Yeah,
on,
please
let's see.
do.
I kind of have to turn it over or turn it around, but
Okay.
anyway, it's over there with the Norma Talmadge. Anyway, that picture, the picture of Frances, the painting, was given to me by the woman who was her secretary until the early 40s. And she had it over her bed. And she would always, when I visited her out in Palm Springs, and she would say, now go say hi to Frances, so, over her bed. And she'd say, now that painting's yours. And I'd say, Martha, I'm in no hurry. And we finally lost Martha at 104. She was such a fountain of information for me. But I always found it amazing that this woman in, the year 2000 has over her bed the picture of a woman she stopped working for in 1941. That's how much Frances meant to her.
And I think we'll get onto those kind of friendships and bonds. One of the things that, the extra things it's worth saying is that a lot of the people that we are talking about in this conversation came through journalism or theater or something. But Frances, didn't she worked in photography and she came through the visual medium, didn't she?
Well, she wasn't an artist. She'd taken classes. Her life was, she was raised by, in San Francisco, family that had money. Both Caruso and Jack London would come for dinner at the family. This was the way she was raised. And the best schools. And then there was the earthquake of 1906. And it wiped out her father's buildings and his holdings that produced the money for the family. And her parents got divorced. And she had to leave art school. So she did go to Berkeley to continue her education, UC Berkeley, which was a lot cheaper than the private school she'd been going to. And excuse me, she became a newspaper reporter and an artist for papers, because at the time they didn't run photographs as often as they did paint drawings. And she, in fact, met Marie Dressler in San Francisco when she was a star. Yeah, and Marie was a huge vaudeville star, and Frances was sent to draw her picture and do a little article on her. So, it's just amazing how these life stories weave together.
Our next picture is, you mentioned her several times, the extraordinary Anita. Who is Anita?
Yeah, I love, I fall in love with these pictures, but here's Anita Luce, 1915 at Biograph, as they often did, working outdoors, right? I mean, this was the office, because it could be. And she obviously has not become the sophisticated elephant she will become in 1950.
This is before she wrote the famous stage play Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, for example.
She wrote that in 1926 it ended up being syndicated in a magazine first, then became a play, then became a movie. It was a silent film, as you know, Mark, starring Buck Henry's mother.
Absolutely, our mutual friend. Yeah.
It was a lost film. It's a lost film. Anyway, this is taken 11 years before she writes Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. But she's writing all kinds of things for Griffith. She started out writing from San Diego, sending one-page story ideas to Griffith back in New York. Mm-hmm. And she got paid $25 a piece.
Griffith, D.W. Griffith.
And they're back and forth. So when Griffith finally came, when Biograph and Griffith, but then he left Biograph, came to Hollywood, so that, she hightailed it up there. Her mother wouldn't let her go until, well, if you read, this is what I mean about, I love these women, but if you read her autobiography, you would think she was 12 years old when she came to Hollywood. Mm-hmm. But she was 25 and she'd always been married. She'd been married once, but divorced quickly. mainly because her mother just, her mother wasn't sending a virgin to Hollywood. So, I mean, that's what her mother thought, right? Her mother just said, I'm going to protect you until you're a properly married woman. So Anita got married to the first guy who asked, and then divorced him a couple of months later, and then headed to Hollywood, and where she was, content until women started, till the mid-40s, when she moved to New York, where she stayed the rest of her life.
I mean, she
traveled the world. She traveled everywhere.
And she was quite, how would you character? I mean, she was quite wild, wasn't she? She wasn't bourgeois. She wasn't tame. She wasn't, when she wrote about, the excitement of being alive, didn't she? Is that the right way to say it?
Oh, yes. And she was so, she was smart. She was whip smart. She created, in creating Lorelei Lee and The Gentleman Preferred Blondes, I think of her as creating the first smart, dumb blonde, right? And actually, that's very much Anita. She would pretend, I would do this for nothing. I'm having so much fun. Yeah, I just whip these things out. And in reality, when you read her appointment books, you see she's agonizing over her work. She's agonizing over her relationships. Mm-hmm. She's, but then she would go out and put on this front of carefree, and she was not quite 5 feet tall, okay?
Yeah.
And in her diary, she writes, 106, exclamation point, and then massages every day for a week, because she weighed in at 106, and she didn't allow herself to weigh over 100 pounds. So these were the things that, when you go, this is why I say I know these people,
Yeah.
Probably better than they would prefer.
That's what, when I've talked to you over the years, we met years ago, and then I've spent time with you in Los Angeles, and you make me feel like really close to these people, because everybody watching this will say you use their first name rather than their second name.
Oh yeah, I do.
And even now, see this glass, I'm drinking of this, the great Jane Russell came to my flat here where I'm sitting now and drank from this glass. And of course, she was in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, which Anita wrote, etc. And that kind of intimacy and closeness, you've never sort of been afraid of being passionate about, the sort of love for these people, have you?
I do love them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's.
I love their energy. I love how much they tried. Let me also point out the bigger, step back a minute and say that, Hollywood in the teens was a magnet for creative people, creative women and Jews. Women and Jews built Hollywood because they weren't wanted anywhere else. They weren't welcome in any other profession. Okay? So, and yet women had been writers for a long time in terms of at least novels and magazine stories, right? So, and people would say, oh, it's a natural for women because all it takes is paper and a pen and you can tell your story once you've reorganized your living room or something. It was just the condescension to these women in much of the writing is just jaw-dropping. But that's what it was. But once they got there and got in and somehow became friends with each other, which they did, it all blossomed. And Hollywood blossomed. But half of all films made before, and Lizzie Frankie is the one who, found this in the copyright papers, half of all films written before 1929 were written by women. Jeez. But, you got to dig through all that crap to find that out. We think of Anita as diamonds are a girl's best friend and all that stuff. It's a lot of fun. But before she moved to that, she helped create the athletic pictures that would bring Doug Fairbanks to fame. before he moved on to Swashbucklers, he spent several years doing just hilarious comedies, but where he'd be bouncing over things and falling downstairs and all kinds of things. And Anita wrote many of those films. And I just kind of love this with the two of them conferring. Doug always got the best of whatever he could out of people, and they were together for several years, along with the man who would become Anita's husband, John Emerson. He would direct the films, and Anita would write them, at least for a little while. And then by 1920, they'd separated and gone on. So anyway, that's
interesting that women imagining men, Anita imagining Doug, and June Mathis imagining,
Valentino.
Rudy Valentino, who we're about to talk about, and they poured their imagination into these icons on screen, didn't they?
Well, yes, but they became them through their pens, right? I mean, June created. I mean, she met Rudy and found him, and he was a dancer, in the dance halls, for Christ's sake. Over from Italy, God love him. And June saw in him, real star quality, and wrote adapted Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And I remember seeing it was in Pordenone, actually. I saw Four Horsemen for the first time on the big screen, and I'd seen Valentino films, but they've been on, in little cubbies on little screens. And so on comes the tango scene in Four Horsemen. And I was like, oh, okay, now I get it. Oh, boy, do I get it. Now, Adela Rogers St. John said that the reason that Rudy was so mesmerizing was that he stared, and so intriguing with those eyes, was that he was very, very short-sighted. He couldn't see a thing, so he was always staring at people that way.
Just to be clear, June insisted.
I have no idea if that's true.
Isn't that right? Yeah, I mean, she, people didn't want Rudy in this famous Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, but she insisted on it. Yeah.
Yeah.
As you well know, there's this fantastic scene where in the German bit towards the end of the film, where the guys walk down the steps and they're dressed as women. And and June, I read that she said this, she talked about this thing about dressing men as women, and she said, to those who have lived and read and who have understood life, that was one of the most terrific scenes in the picture. She was really knowledgeable, June Mathis, wasn't she? And really broad-minded. She had really lived, this woman.
Yes, she really had. And she also, she was incredibly well-read.
Yeah.
She was smart. And to the people like Frances and Anita, she was the grown-up in the room. She was the mentor or the example of what you could do, because the way she conducted herself and her sense of personal security, right? And her knowledge and her willingness to go up against, not Rex Ingram necessarily, but as much as some of the other people, she would defend her case. She would defend her beliefs. And she would often win, because she was very persuasive and knowledgeable.
And we're getting a sense in this conversation of this kind of spider's web, or this connection between June and Frances and Lois, etc. And now we have to add another person into the picture. Our next, we've got a picture here of Bess Meredith.
Now, Bess was one of those. Bess was a writer who was sent to Italy to assess what was happening, and one of three people, and then bring it back to Los Angeles. And she's also
to assess what is happening in Ben-Hur. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So Ben-Hur, just for people who know, this is this huge epic silent film that was going to be one of the biggest films ever made, and yet it was in disaster. And who do you send to
Well, it
sort
was
out the
very
disaster? It's
expensive.
Bess Meredith.
Yeah, I'm not sure what, what condition, but just the money was going, and it had been when Thalberg and Mayer came in to run the newly created MGM, it was one of the first things that stared them back in their face over all this money being spent 8,000 miles away. So what are we going to do? We're going to have to get it back here. We're going to have to bring it under control. This is the beginning of, big business taking over, the show business. And so they sent Bess and a couple of other people over. And the guy she's standing next to is Silvano, who was a cinematographer on Ben-Hur, but he ended up marrying June Mathis, and June, she said she didn't get to bring much home from Italy, but she brought home Silvano, and that was pretty nice. So.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it interesting that in the time of crisis, they asked this woman that lots of us haven't heard of to steady the ship?
Yeah, but Bess had already, this is doodle-doo to what, 24, in 14, she had gone with her husband, Wilford Lucas, who was an actor who, and they had gone to Australia. She spent a year writing and directing Tarzan pictures. She had written and directed something called, and starred in, Bess the Detectress, a series of detective films starring Bess, but also written by her. And she was, if you looked in the 1920 Los Angeles City Directory, the equivalent of the phone book, under film companies, one of the company, a lot of company names, and then there's Bess Meredith by herself. She put out a shingle to be a writer and a script doctor, although they didn't call him that then, right?
It was an independent company, yeah. And
right.
And Cari, didn't she also marry Michael Curtiz? Is that right?
She did. She married Curtiz later on in the 30s. By the time that happened, she wrote for just about everybody. She wrote for MGM. She wrote for DeMille. She wrote, she'd be called in, as I say, to be the equivalent of a script doctor. Yeah. What in the hell she saw in Curtiz, I don't know. I know Francis didn't know. Although Francis, they stayed friends for a while. They were looking at writing Mildred Pierce together, Francis and Curtiz. But one of my favorite stories, for instance, from Casablanca, the set of Casablanca, is that, the Epstein brothers would say, well, let's do this or let's do that. And Curtiz would say, just a minute. And he would go around the corner, call Bessie, talk it out with her, and then come back and tell them what they were going to do. Yeah.
So Casablanca, he called her at least once, maybe twice a day when he was directing Casablanca. So, well, remarkable. Right, we should move on. We've got a Canadian now. We're going to Canada. Nell Shipman.
Yes. Well,
why did you choose this picture?
From Canada. I mean, Norma Shears from Canada, Mary Pickford, and of course Marie Dressler. Nell, I always like putting Nell in for a couple of reasons. One, I mean, she's at one point at Universal, okay, in the late teens. There were a good half dozen women directing, short films primarily, but they were all working and they were directors. And I mean, Lois Weber was the first mayor of Universal City, and Lois helped bring these women in. Nell, it was like 1920. She said, oh, I don't know, this business is getting too businessy for me, right? And she liked making her animal pictures and documentaries.
She was an animal rights activist and very, yeah.
And all it would take, remember in those days too, to make a picture was you needed a cameraman, right? And maybe somebody like a director, producer who would kind of, herd the cats. And that was it. And some performers, maybe a light, maybe no light. A lot of these were just done naturally. So anyway, I love this picture of Nell because it's just, and she said in like 1920, she said, oh, the business here has passed me by. So for many people, they were just coming and getting excited about the possibilities. But Nell and a couple of others just said, that's enough. I'm out of here.
I think she was she had a real independent spirit, didn't she? You know, she didn't.
Yes, and she knew.
Fall in with the
thing.
studios.
These women believed in themselves to a point, you know, and despite they knew who they were, and Nell definitely knew who. She knew what she thought she was supposed to be doing, and that was, you know, working with her animals.
So now we're going on to somebody who I'm very surprised that you chose a picture of. Why did you choose Ayn Rand?
I read.
First of all, who is she? For people who don't know, who she's most famous for The Fountainhead, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, she's just, you know. Oh, should we be kind and call her a fascist bitch? Oh, no, excuse me. Anyway.
Born.
She, this is a picture of her at a place called the Hollywood Studio Club. And when I wrote about the Hollywood Studio Club a couple of years ago, it was again founded in part by Mary Pickford in like 1916, because these women needed a place to live and be, you know, quote unquote, protected. And actually it thrived until the early 1970s. But Ayn Rand lived there briefly in the early 20s. She was an extra. She wanted to work in Hollywood, and Cecil B. DeMille hired her she got a small role in The King of Kings, for God's sake. But the reason, you know, so many of these women took care of each other, right, in different ways. And Ayn is the example of not doing that, in the sense that when she was at the Hollywood Studio Club, and there were about 100 women there, she was always poor mouthing. She was always saying, oh, I don't have any money. I don't have any money. What am I supposed to do? So that when a donor, and there were quite a few donors to the studio club, offered the manager a $50 gift certificate equivalent to the woman who needed it most, the manager gave it to Ayn Rand, who proceeded to go out and buy black underwear with her $50. and just decided this Hollywood stuff was just a little too much hard work, bought her black underwear, married a guy she'd met on the King of Kings set, and left.
And is she the exception to the rule? What we're talking about, a lot of these women would be, you know, very democratic, would they be leftist?
Well, not just. I mean, it would be more sensitive to other women's needs. Let's just say, or empathetic. I mean, it's whenever anybody calls, you know, Hollywood a liberal bastion, I always go, wait a minute. You know, one of the main requirements of storytelling, I think, is empathy.
Empathy.
You have to be able to empathize with, you know, characters, right?
Yeah.
And if you can empathize and care about other people, you tend to be more, you know, liberal in your politics.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've just kind of stuck her in as an example of, I mean, it wasn't all peace and love by a long shot. Let's put it that way.
And our next person is quite different, Lenore Coffey. So why did you choose an image of her?
There's only about 3 or 4 that I've ever found. She was very, very articulate, she also kind of held back. She's another one, sort of like Bess Meredith, in the sense of she could find problems with the script and fix them. So she was very valued for that. But she originally came from San Francisco, and in San Francisco, she read all the movie magazines, and the movie magazines would advertise that different film companies were looking for writers. So Lenore decided that was where she was going to go. And this was, I think, like 1919, 1920. She came for the first time to Hollywood, you know, and fell in love with Los Angeles and stayed for quite some time. She ended up in the late 40s moving with her family to England. And she wrote a book too, but it was in the late 50s and published by a British publisher. So it was hard to find hard to find here, but I found it, of course.
Of course you did. Yeah. I read this great story that Irving Thalberg phoned her up and said, I've got like 100 extras here, and I need a speech for my star. I can't remember who, and she wrote the speech in 30 minutes, and I don't know how you phone it in or something. I mean,
exactly, and Irving. Irving and writers there's a relationship that could take an hour right there, just Irving and his writers. But he would just, as he would say, I would give my kingdom to not need them. I wish I didn't need writers so much, but he did, and he had tremendous respect for them, and he also really respected his women writers. Most of his writers were female, and he maintained that it was women who brought men into the theaters, not the other way around. Women picked the movies they were seeing. And so he had tremendous respect for his women writers. He treated them very well. And he would send cars for them. And he would, and like with Lenore in that business of, I need a speech, I've got to use this stuff. He would say, okay, the car will be there in 30 minutes to pick it up. You don't have to come in. And that was the other thing. Decades before there was any kind of flexible employment, right? If you wanted to work at home, you could work at home. Wherever you worked the best, go ahead. He, as I say, he just respected the work, and as long as it was done on time, he was all for it. And she would just come up with ideas for different turning points in scripts that was truly valued, along with her other stories. She never found her niche or her fame like she sort of thought she should have. But she also was married and had children, and that's what she wanted to do. So,
Could I ask you?
A lot of these people never had children. June Mathis, by the way, died. She had a heart attack in a movie theater in 1927. She was 40 years old when she died. So, we lost her very early. And Anita, didn't have children. A lot of them didn't have kids because they looked around and figured if they liked their work, they better not have a family too.
You had yourself 2 boys. Was that easy? A career and being a mom with 2 boys?
It wasn't too long ago, actually. My younger son, Jake, said to me that at one point his girlfriend's family had been asking about, telling him all about their summer vacations that they planned out every year. And, it was and then they said, Jake, what did you do for your summer vacations? Jake said, his mom was going to tell him. I just said, we didn't exactly have summer vacations. It was more like, Mom's got a job, let's hit the road. And at first I thought, oh God, how embarrassing. And then I thought, no, I'm really proud of that. I mean, I talk to them both every day. They're 2 of my very best friends. And, I always knew I'd love them. I didn't know I'd like them so much. But it, I just always said, I value your opinion, but I have veto power, right? But tell me what you think. Tell me what you think. And, they're both critical thinkers because of that. We had a great time. We just made it work. So
we're going to talk about Dorothy.
Are we ready? So Dorothy Arzner is amazing in so many ways. She was born and raised in Los Angeles, and her father ran a restaurant downtown. So from a very early age, she was around Pickford and Griffith and all these people that she just was totally unimpressed with. Thank you very much. She was going to be a doctor, went to University of Southern California, and until World War I, and she was like 17 years old, she started driving an ambulance locally, wanted to go to France, but ended up being introduced to William DeMille, who said, you ought to be in movies. Come on over, hang out for a week or so at the studio where he and his brother worked, and just look around.
Cecil, yeah.
Brother Cecil B, right. And it was on day 2 of just hanging out that Dorothy saw Cecil directing. And she said, oh my God, I saw this man, and everybody around him was catering to his every need, handing him this, carrying the chair, carrying the megaphone. And I decided then and there, that's what I want to do. So she had her eye very early on becoming a director. And she started out in the, even though she couldn't type, she started out in the steno pool, she learned how to type very quickly, the scripts. And of course, by doing that, she was reading the scripts, and she became a reader. And then she was taken under her wing by a woman editor. So she goes into the editing department, and she loves editing because she's able to work alone and tell a story, and she'll stay up all night and having a great time. She ended up, the crisis that brought Dorothy to be recognized was that the film Blood and Sand with Valentino was not ready at all, and yet all of the Paramount salesmen were coming to town. And this was at a time when movies were sold state by state. Can you imagine? Anyway, and they would have these conventions where they would show the salesmen what was coming up, and they had nothing to show. So Dorothy went in, Valentino agreed to spend a day waving his cape around, and Dorothy went in and shot some scenes and edited together a piece that a trailer, as it were, that everybody agreed was just fabulous.
Blood and Sand?
For Blood and Sand, and like 23, I want to say. And so all of a sudden she came to the attention of quite a few people, including the director, let's see, what was the movie she went and did with him? Anyway, she would do several films where she would be the continuity person by day and edit all night. She said she worked 16 hours a day, but it didn't matter because she loved it so much.
And so why, I mean, we've moved on. A lot of our conversation's been about totally silent cinema, and there she is. Look at her.
There we go. Now we're starting to move to talking.
Look at the way she's touching the camera and touching. I think that's sort of a box on which there's some sound equipment.
Yes,
could be. Like that ownership, and she looks comfortable.
Yeah, the development of sound. We always think of. We're told that. Al Jolson, sang Mammy and everything changed. No, it was a 2 to 3 year process, right? And when Dorothy fought for herself, but was eventually given a film to direct, which the first film she was given to direct was called Fashions for Women. And that's another reason I love this picture. It kind of shows the irony of giving a woman who dresses like this every day a movie called Fashions for Women, but they did, so, whatever. God love her. And she said, they never gave me much, but I always managed to make the best of it. And indeed she did. Now, when we go to back to the picture of her with Clara Bow, the two of them, got along wonderfully well, but they made The Wild Party, which was Clara's first talkie. Now, to show you the difference, over at MGM, they gave Garbo like 2.5 years to get ready for a talkie. And over at Paramount, they gave Columbia, they gave Clara Bow about 3 weeks. And Clara Bow wasn't a particularly secure young woman to begin with. But Dorothy was incredibly sensitive and took care of her people, not just the actors, but the rest of the crew as well. And with Clara, it was the scenes out of Singing in the Rain are not that much of an exaggeration, of literally singing into the flower decorations, because that's where the microphone was. And so microphones would be placed all over the set, but you didn't know where to go, and it would still come in and out. And seeing this, Dorothy said to one of her crew members, do you fish? And he said, well, yeah. She said, great, tomorrow bring in a fishing pole. So he brought in a fishing pole, and she put the microphone at the end of the fishing pole, and the boom mic was born. and it followed Clara. Clara didn't have to follow the mic. And it gave Clara a freedom to be herself and be her vivacious, normal self. And it was really a great little partnership between Dorothy and Clara. Now, Dorothy is considered the first female studio director, even though we had dozens of women directors before Dorothy. She's often pointed to as the first one because she worked for a studio, and also because the others, of course, aren't half as well known. But she was so practical, so hard. You know, for years, people would ask me, why weren't there any women cinematographers? And I don't know, and you know, this or that, or the cameras or something. I don't know why. And I finally read Dorothy, a long interview Dorothy did with Brownlow, where he said, why would there no women cinematographers? And she said, well, because there were enough men who wanted the jobs. And as long as men wanted the jobs, that's who filled them. And I was like, oh, of course, you know, you're looking for something more complicated. No, it's pretty basic. And when he asked her, well, did you ever have an assistant director? Or, you know, because particularly in sound, they would give you an assistant director. And she said, oh, God, no, they would have given me a man.
And do you think, you know, I mean,
she was so direct.
It's so fascinating. Do you think that Dorothy Arzner was happy directing within the studio system? Was she fighting against the system? You know, some of her, you know, famous films, you know, lots of people watching this will have seen Dance Girl Dance and some of her other films.
Yeah, Merrily We Go to Hell.
Merrily We Go to Hell. Was she pushing against the system in any way?
No,
or was she comfortable within the system?
No, she wasn't comfortable, but she wasn't pushing a lot either. She would put her blinders on. She would make it work. When you go back and you watch Dance Girl Dance again, you look at, and remember, she's not only, it's not just the system, the studios, it's, you know, the Hays Code she's got over her head. And you look at what she did through costumes, what she tells, the story she tells through the costumes. And in Dance Girl Dance with Lucy, every time Lucy shows up after being gone for a day or a week, Lucille Ball's character shows up. She's got a new fur on. She's got more jewels. I mean, we know where Lucy's getting these, you know, where she's getting her money, right? But we never say anything. And there's just a variety of little ways in how she dresses. And the ballet master, the woman who's the way she dresses her, and she replaced a man. So it becomes this whole Dance Girl Dance is this story of these different kinds of women and how the compromises they all make. And the women are such the center of the story. And she would tweak things like that. Dorothy would, the movie you end up with in an Arzner film is not necessarily the one that you started to read in the first script. She's enriched it in ways that you have to tip your hat to her.
And Cari, do you think her sexuality was relevant to this? You know, she was gay, and she was with the same partner, Marion Morgan, is that her name, for 40 years?
Yeah, she also met who was a dance instructor. Who she met on the set, right? And they were together for, Jesus, what, 40 some odd years at least?
Yeah, and I think that Marion choreographed the famous scene that people who know Arzner's work often know, that famous scene with Maureen O'Hara, and she's talking to the men and saying, why are you looking at me? And I think Marion choreographed that scene. So is the sexuality issue relevant here at all in the case of...
You know, it's so interesting to me because it was like Dorothy never hid who she was, and she never flaunted who she was. She just conducted herself. Obviously, she, you know, you can tell from the pictures and from her dress. There were a few people, women in particular, who would make references to saying they weren't all that comfortable working too closely with her. But then once they got to know her, and they knew, her family situation. I mean, living at home with Marion. She also had a family, but her parents who were very supportive of her. I mean, remarkably. And just for Dorothy, there was no, this is who I am. And then walking through the world that way. But not, not with signs on or lights or horns blowing. Just, this is me. Okay.
And we're moving on now to an English person, Ida Lupino, another pioneering filmmaker, but here she's what, 14, 15 or something?
Yeah, 14, 15, coming over to America as an actress, being brought over, and she looks so much older than 14, really, I think there. Yeah. And she would, play, and of course, like so many women before and since, she was very frustrated with the roles she was offered. So she started writing her own and creating her own, and decided she wanted to direct. And boy, you talk about somebody who had to fight, because it's one of those times when you get into the late 40s and the early 50s, it's a hell of a lot harder for women than it had been back in the 20s and 30s.
Now, just to pause you a moment, why was it harder in the 40s and 50s than the 20s or 30s?
Because there weren't many of them left. There weren't many of them at all. There was no, when Ida, for over a decade, and Ida was the second woman, thank you very much, after Dorothy, to become a member of the Directors Guild, of what became the Directors Guild, right? And for over a decade, if you stood up to speak at a Directors Guild meeting, the first thing you said was, "Gentlemen and Miss Lupino."
Yeah.
I mean, wow. Okay.
We just have to take a moment to address this, because we've talked about Alice and Lois and Adela and Frances and Anita and June and Bess, all these people, and Nell and Lenore, all who worked in silent cinema. So what happened?
Okay, well, in a nutshell, as it were, with sound films, the budgets quadrupled, okay? And at the same time, the studios are becoming real studios. They're consolidating. And one of the things I've noticed in the history of Hollywood is very few decisions were ever made proactively. Everything was a reaction. They did this, we did that. We did this, we got to react to all the business of it. Plus, and it was a business, and when sound came in, Wall Street came in. And when Wall Street came in with their checkbooks, all kinds of questions were being asked. I mean, one of my favorite examples, because I love these little pinpointy things, when Irving Thalberg died in 1936, over 40 films a year were being made by 4 or 5 different supervisors. They weren't even called producers, okay? So 4 or 5 guys are churning out 40 films a year. 5 years later, under just Louis B. Mayer and his incredible insecurities, 40 films a year are being turned out by over 40 producers. The bureaucracy has just mushroomed. So have the expenses of it all, but the expenses aren't on the screen. They're in this incredible bureaucracy that's been built up. So
what was the implication for women of that?
Oh, well, I go to Frances in part for this. She said that writing for films became like writing in the sand with the wind machine blowing. That all of us, these are for writers, okay? That all of a sudden, instead of saying, oh, go do a Western, or let's agree to do this and come back with a script, all of a sudden they were being handed scripts